There are two processes involved in the development of an egg cell. There's follicular development. That's what this video is about. It's about the cellular package that contains the oocyte. And then there's also the meiotic events that give rise to the oocyte itself. So just quickly, the highlights of the meiotic events are that meiosis begins prior to the person being born. And so that's why the population of oogonia in the ovaries are known as primary oocytes, because they've entered meiosis, but then they stay inactive. They stay like that until puberty. And so they're quiet until puberty, and then starting at puberty, some of the primary oocytes present in the ovary will continue meiosis where they left off. And that first meiotic division that gives rise to the secondary oocyte and the first polar body occurs just prior to ovulation. And so ovulation is the release of the secondary oocyte. Notice that at puberty, when some of the primary oocytes start to continue in meiosis, that the cellular package, or in other words, the follicle, will also start growing and getting bigger and more complex. So let's take a closer look at the changes that the follicle goes through. In this diagram, we can see the type of follicle that a female is born with. A female is born with many small follicles that kind of cluster together on the outer periphery of the ovary. They're called primordial follicles. In the micrograph, we can see some primordial follicles, and these primordial follicles consist of a primary oocyte with a single layer of squamous cells, flat cells called follicular cells. Once the person enters puberty, hormones from the brain, particularly follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, good name, is going to cause some of these follicles to wake up. It's going to activate them. And when the follicles first start responding to hormonal changes, the primordial follicle is going to differentiate into a primary follicle. Taking a look at the primary follicle, the oocyte is still a primary oocyte, but notice how the follicular cells are no longer squamous. They're now more cuboidal or columnar in shape. And so the primary follicle is much larger than the primordial follicle. What happens next is the follicular cells start to divide by mitosis, giving us multiple layers of cells. This is what it looks like. Once you have more than one layer of follicular cells, as we can see here, there are multiple layers, those cells are now known as granulosa cells. And once we have multiple layers of granulosa cells that surround, this is still the primary oocyte, then the whole structure is called a secondary follicle. In a secondary follicle, the primary oocyte starts to deposit a layer of sugar and protein on the outer membrane of the oocyte, known as the zona pellucida. And then the granulosa cells that are growing in number also have a few jobs. One thing that they do is they produce and secrete follicular fluid, which starts to accumulate within the follicle. Granulosa cells also produce estrogen, and so as the follicle is growing bigger in the ovary, estrogen levels are going up. Taking a look at this follicle, this is still a secondary follicle. We can see the outer periphery of the follicle here, and we can see that all those pink cells are granulosa cells. Notice the pools of follicular fluid that are starting to accumulate within this secondary follicle. This is still a primary oocyte because remember, the first meiotic division doesn't occur until just before ovulation. We can also see the zona pellucida surrounding the oocyte. Another thing that we can really notice here is that the ovarian tissue that's surrounding the follicle, this region, is starting to change to support the life of the follicle. That ovarian tissue surrounding the follicle is known as the theca folliculi. It consists of two layers, the theca interna, which is a rich blood supply to the follicle, and then theca externa, which is a connective tissue encasement of the follicle. Eventually, as the secondary follicle grows bigger and accumulates more follicular fluid, these little pools of follicular fluid are going to merge into one big lake, one big cavity of fluid known as the antrum. Once the follicular fluid merges into one big cavity called the antrum, we can see that here, this follicle is known as a vesicular follicle, also known as a tertiary follicle or a Graafian follicle. We can see all of the main parts that we talked about. Here's the outer periphery of the follicle and all of the granulosa cells below that in dark pink, still secreting estrogen. We can see that there are granulosa cells that are kind of separating the oocyte up on a stalk, and granulosa cells surround the oocyte. Those granulosa cells are known as the corona radiata, and they're surrounding the zona pellucida. And of course, the cell is still a primary oocyte until just before ovulation. What will happen to the vesicular follicle is it will start to bulge from the surface of the ovary. Taking a look at this diagram, here's the vesicular follicle, and this is what I was trying to describe. It will actually start to bulge from the surface of the ovary, and just prior to ovulation, that's when the first meiotic division is going to occur to give rise to the secondary oocyte, which is the cell that gets ovulated, and then the first polar body. Here's a photograph of the ovary just prior to ovulation, where we can see the ovary with the whitish appearance in the background, and we can see the follicle bulging from the surface, and then you can even see the oocyte about to be released. And so you can see it's like a blister that forms on the surface of the ovary. After ovulation occurs, the empty follicle repairs itself, and it actually thrives and becomes a structure called the corpus luteum. The follicle that no longer contains the oocyte is still secreting hormones too. We know that the growing follicle containing the oocyte secretes estrogen in increasing amounts as it gets larger. Once ovulation occurs, estrogen levels drop because that follicle is damaged. But once the follicle repairs and becomes a corpus luteum, those cells primarily secrete progesterone, and so progesterone levels start going up. The corpus luteum has a limited lifespan. Eventually, it starts to die off, and that's known as the corpus albicans. Here we can see the microscopic appearance of the corpus luteum. And just to compare that to the corpus albicans, you can see how it looks like the same structure, but it's shriveled up